Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting Blender tutorial. In this video I want to give you a crash course for how to use Blender 2.80, which is the next big release of Blender that is going to be completed and released hopefully a little bit later this year. Now, for all of you impatient people, there's going to be timestamps down below, so go and check them out and you can jump to anywhere you want in this video. For everyone else, let's swipe back to the studio. Now, Blender 2.80 is actually a big step up from Blender 2.79. It brings a ton of improvements to the UI, to workflows, existing tools, it adds a whole bunch of new features and performance improvements and much more. I have been a bit reluctant to create tutorials for it too early because, as I said, Blender 2.80 is still in active development and as such can still change, but we are getting closer to the actual release and I think it's finally time to create a tutorial to show you how to use this awesome and, by the way, free 3D program. Very quick intermission, because I know I'm risking a flame war in the comments. I keep calling this release Blender 2.80 and not Blender 2.8 since technically that is really what it is. However, I know that a lot of people are simply calling it Blender 2.8 and I might use either one since they're used pretty interchangeably. But I can hear people grinding their teeth already, and to keep that music going for just a little bit longer, I might just keep calling it Blender 2.80 in this video. Now, I am very deliberately calling this a crash course because, for one, as I said, Blender 2.80 is still in active development and depending which daily build you grab, it may still have issues and it may still crash. And secondly, this is not meant to be a comprehensive guide, and if there is anything along the way that you want to know more about, just leave me some comments down below and I can make separate videos for all of those topics. In this video, I simply want to give you a quick overview of how Blender 2.80 works, what has changed, and show you some of the awesome stuff that you can do with it. If you have used Blender before, hopefully this video will cover enough of what has changed to help you transition over to the latest version. If you've never used Blender before, hopefully this tutorial will be enough to get you excited and show you the basics of how to use this awesome 3D tool. But we're not going to learn anything just sitting around chatting, so let's jump right into the tutorial. First off, let's talk about how you can get your hands on Blender 2.80. Simply pop open your favorite web browser and go to builder.blender.org/download, and here you can download the latest daily builds for Blender. Blender, in case you don't know, is available for Windows, Mac and Linux, and on this page you can download the daily builds for Blender 2.80, which is still in beta, or you can get the actual stable release, which is version 2.79. Do note though, and there's a big note at the very top, that these are daily builds. They include the latest features and therefore they may be unstable or have bugs. Now, for this tutorial we're going to look at 2.80 because that is the latest and greatest and the really big release coming out for Blender very soon. I want to show you how to use it. Also, if you do find any issues like it doesn't load, there's crashes or bugs, the best place to report them, simply go to developer.blender.org and then just report that as a bug, like it's crashing, some features aren't working. This is really the best place to get support because this is where the Blender developers live. They're really quick to respond and then address all of the issues. But for now, if you want to follow along, simply grab yourself the latest Blender 2.80 beta build. The one I'm using is the January 28, 2019 build. And then let's fire up Blender 2.80. This is the opening screen for Blender 2.80, and one of the interesting things that Blender 2.80 added is Workspaces. So you can actually start with a general project, which is just the default. You can also go into 2D animation with the grease pencil, which again I'm probably going to cover in a totally separate tutorial. You can go directly into sculpting or visual effects compositing or video editing. Now I'm actually just going to click this away, and I'm also going to come into File and go Load Factory Settings and then say yes, Load Factory Settings, so that Blender 2.80 resets to the factory settings, and I don't have any custom key maps or anything else that might throw you off if you're trying to follow along. But let's start looking at what has actually changed and all of the cool stuff that you can do with Blender 2.80. Also, in case you don't remember, this is what Blender 2.79 looks like. Comparison, this is Blender 2.80. Things have moved around considerably. Obviously, I have a different theme. I have a darker theme, which shouldn't throw you off too much. But the biggest thing that has changed, if you're coming from Blender 2.79, is that you're now selecting with your left mouse button. Blender traditionally used to have right-click selection, which threw a lot of people off. It's much more standard now, so it's left-click to select, click and drag for box selection, which is really useful, and then your right-click is simply a context menu, depending on where you're at. If you're used to left-click moving the 3D cursor, that one can now be moved with Shift and right click, so you can still move the 3D cursor around, but yeah, left click select, click and drag for box selection, and then your right click is simply a context menu. One interesting thing that I didn't actually know, if you have multiple objects that overlap and you click to select, and you click again, it'll actually cycle through all of the objects that are underneath your cursor, or you can hold down Alt, or I believe it'll be Option on the Mac, and click, and you'll actually get a little menu pop up with all of the objects that are underneath the cursor, so I can now select my cube. So that's just useful if you have a whole lot of objects in your scene. By the way, if you're a beginner and you're wondering what this 3D cursor thing is that you can move with Shift and right click, this is essentially a marker in 3D space that you can position anywhere in your scene, and any new objects you create will be created at the 3D cursor. So if I come up into the menu, select Add, Mesh, Cube, that will get created at the 3D cursor. It's very useful for a whole lot of other things, so just in case you're starting out with Blender, that's what the cursor is for. Also, in case you want to know how to navigate around your viewport, if you hold and click your middle mouse button and drag, you will rotate. If you hold down Shift, click middle mouse button and drag, you will move. And if you hold down Control, middle mouse button and forward and backwards will zoom you in and out. To zoom, you can also use the mouse wheel. And another new thing in Blender 2.80, you have this little 3D gimbal over on the right hand side. You can actually simply click and drag on that to rotate around. You can also click on any of these cubes. So the X one, for example, I'll get into the side view, Y, Z, or just click and drag to kind of just rotate around my scene. Now, one question I got a lot is, what do you do if you don't have a middle mouse button? Let's say you're on a Mac, or you just have a 2-button mouse, or you don't have a numpad. Blender does use the numpad keys a fair bit. Or if you're on a laptop that doesn't have a numpad, well, you can actually emulate all of those, and you can change all of that in the user settings, and there under Edit, Preferences. Let me just bring that in. By the way, if you are used to Blender 2.79, just be aware that the settings and the way everything is organized has changed quite a bit, but in my mind, I think it makes a lot more sense to a newcomer. Everything is just a bit better grouped together, in my opinion. And if you're looking for the mouse and keyboard settings, they're under Input, and over on the right hand side under Keyboard, you can say Emulate a numpad, which means your normal keys 1 through to 0 on the keyboard will actually emulate the numpad. And then the mouse, you can also enable Emulate 3-button mouse. By the way, all of these cool tooltips that you now have all over the Blender interface, they're also new to Blender 2.18. They're really, really useful if you're just getting started. So emulate middle mouse with Alt and left mouse, so enable that. Now I can simply press Alt and left, and it'll be like a middle mouse button. But I have a 3-button mouse, I also have a numpad, so I don't need either of those. Now, if you're a hardcore Blender user and you really hate left-click select just because it feels very different to what Blender used to be like, although I think it's a big improvement, under key map, you can actually change select with right. So you can actually go back to right-click select. You can also change what the spacebar does. Traditionally, spacebar opened search, which is now, I believe, under F3 by default, but it's been changed to be play, and that's simply to be aligned with more video editing tools and other 3D programs where spacebar is play your timeline or space to stop again. So I'm going to keep it on the default, select with left, and spacebar is play. Another important setting, if you're a beginner under System, you probably want to change your Cycles Render Device over to CUDA if you have a CUDA-enabled graphics card. I have two 1080 graphics cards in my machine, so they're going to be enabled and help out with the rendering. Under Save and Load, you'll also find a whole bunch of cool settings around, how many save versions. Just go through the system. There's so much stuff. Everything that you used to have here is still here, so nothing really has vanished, but everything is organized a bit more strategically, and it should, for a newcomer, be much easier to navigate. Let's close down the preferences and let's look at all of the changes in the actual interface of Blender. First off, on the left hand side, the tool shelf has been redesigned, and you can actually extend this out if you want to see the text for all of the commands. You can kind of collapse it down. And by the way, I'm holding Control middle mouse and drag up or down to kind of scale this any way I want. So these are all of the tools for your current mode that you're in. So in edit mode, you'll see a whole bunch of different tools. Obviously tab still to go in and out of edit mode, T to show and hide this tab. By the way, you can actually press Shift and spacebar and you get access to all of the controls in your tool shelf. So if I'm in edit mode and go Control and space, you can actually see all of the commands right here and their shortcut keys, so it's really nice and easy to navigate. I'll cover edit mode in a second, so if you're starting out, don't freak out. Also, I have separate videos on my channel that do actually cover the basics of Blender, and most of the basics haven't actually changed. It's just how you do things has changed a fair bit, just to streamline the workflow a little bit, so don't be too concerned if you're just getting into it and not everything makes sense. As I said, if you're pressing space now, this will actually start playing back your timeline, and space again to stop. Search, if you're looking for that, is now on F3, so you can obviously search for whatever command you want. By the way, as I said, you can change all of that. For all of the tutorials I'll be making, I will always use the default settings, because otherwise it's almost impossible to follow along if I've got some custom key maps and what you're pressing doesn't do what I do in my videos. So I'm always going to be using the default mappings, which is also why I'm going to stick with this left click select, which, by the way, I personally actually think is a good improvement. Now, the other thing you may notice if you're coming from Blender 2.79 is that the header of all of your views is now actually at the top. For example, I've got this menu bar here at the top, and if you're new to Blender, you'll be like, of course, that's where it belongs. But if you look at Blender 2.79, the headers, the controls, these menu bars are actually traditionally at the bottom, which personally I always thought was quite confusing. So it's much more in line with other 3D applications now. The header is at the top. If you don't like it, you can simply right click and say flip to bottom, and the header will go back to the bottom. But I actually do like it at the top. It just makes more sense in my brain on how it works. And then again, you have most of the normal controls right at your fingertips. Over on the left-hand side, if you're new to Blender, this is where you can actually change your view. Right now, you're seeing the 3D view, but you could, for example, show the shader editor instead, or the texture node editor, or compositing, or maybe you want the video sequencer where you can actually edit videos in Blender. It's going to return to the 3D view. Then you can obviously change the different types of modes, like object mode, where you place and arrange your scene, edit mode, where you can edit the geometry of your individual meshes, sculpting, vertex painting, weight, and texture painting, a whole bunch of other things. Then obviously you can change view options, select, add new objects, modify objects in any way you want. Then in the middle, you've got your gimbal controls, snapping, proportional editing, I'm going to leave that off, and then obviously the pivot point settings. And over on the right hand side, you've got all of the view related settings. Left hand side, you can have collection visibility, then you can enable different types of objects to be seen. So I can disable visibility on only the meshes, or maybe I don't want to see the lights in my scene. Then I've got a whole bunch of overlays, and I'll get to those ones a little bit more in a minute. You've got global X-ray mode, and then these ones are your basic render mode. So you can go wireframe, solid, which shows just the solid shape of your geometry without the materials. Then you've got look depth, which actually uses an environment light to light your scene, and it will show materials. And then over on the right hand side, you've got the rendered view. Right now, this looks a little bit boring. Maybe I'm just going to add another plane into the scene so we get a few shadows happening, and it just looks a little bit more interesting. And then under shading, depending on what engine and what mode you're in, you've got a whole bunch of different options. Then there's some simple controls to navigate around as well, so you can toggle the camera view on and off. You can click and hold this hand icon to move around, or click and hold this magnification glass to zoom in and out as well. So everything's been rearranged significantly since 2.79, but again, it's just much more in line with all of the other programs that you may already have come across if you haven't worked with earlier versions of Blender. The next big thing that has been introduced with Blender 2.80 are workspaces. So at the very top, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of new tabs. There's a layout tab, which is the one I'm in right now. This represents the layout workspace. There's also a workspace for modeling. And you'll note that it's actually got specific settings already set up for the mode, the shading, the overlays. I'm immediately in edit mode, which I probably want for modeling. Then there's a sculpting workspace, which, look at that, it looks really nice. It actually uses a matte cap, so this is kind of a light that moves around with the camera to show you your geometry, so it's really nice and easy to see. And on the left hand side, I already have all of the sculpting tools because I'm actually already in sculpt mode. There's a workspace for UV editing, so you've got the UV editor on the left hand side and your scene in edit mode over on the right hand side. Texture painting, shading, animation, rendering, compositing, scripting, they're all different workspaces for different purposes, and it makes it much easier to switch from one task to another because, again, they're all really segregated into workspaces. You can very easily add a new workspace, customize it in any way that you want, and then save it as your own. Note that none of the other workspaces have been affected. This is really just a separate workspace with all of my custom settings. You can also enable and disable certain add-ons for workspaces. There's a whole bunch of customizations you can do. And just save it with the startup file. So every time you start up Blender, you have your specific workspace for your specific tasks right at your fingertips. And this is really useful. I really like this feature just because I know that I can just split and unsplit my view and add all of these different views and panels for when I need them, but then they're in the way and I have to take them out again. So workspaces, really great new feature in Blender 2.80. Now let's talk about editing. I'm going to return to the basic layout. And if you're new to Blender, by the way, if you select any object and you press G to grab, you can move the object around. If you grab it and press S, you can scale it up or down, and that's relative from the center of the object to your cursor. So I can scale this up a little bit. Or you can press R and then you can rotate these objects around easily. You can also select the object over on the left-hand side. If you're in object mode, you can actually come over to transform, for example, and you will now see gizmos for transform. So this is much more traditional, feels a bit more like Cinema 4D, so you can kind of move your object around, squash it, scale it, do whatever you want. You obviously have a move, a rotate, or a scale specific mode as well. Again, you can switch between these options much quicker with Shift and Space, and you can go back to your box selection or to any of the other modes. If you want to modify the geometry of any of the objects in your scene, simply select the object, and as before in older versions of Blender, Tab will get you into edit mode, where you've got a whole bunch of controls for extruding faces, modifying vertices, cutting, slicing things, twisting them in any way that you want. Now, if you want to switch between vertex selection, edge selection, and face selection, that is now on your keyboard, simply 1, 2, 3. You can see it up in the panel right here, so you can switch it there as well. By the way, if you hold down Shift, you can actually enable multiples. So I can now have vertex, edge, and face selection enabled at the same time. All of these controls over on the left-hand side, they're also really easy to use because they've got really nice gizmos in the view space. So for example, if I come to extrude region, expand this, maybe I want to extrude along the vertex normals. And now I click and drag. You can kind of see it extruding out. Maybe I need to go to extrude region. Yeah, there it is. See, this is just the basic extrude region. And again, it's got a little gizmo in the viewport, which makes it nice and easy to use. Not all of the operations have those gizmos just yet, but I'm pretty sure they're being added over time. I can see more and more pop up over time. Let's press Tab again to return to object mode. And now, for everybody who loves radial manuals, Control and Tab will bring up a radial manual with all of the modes that are available. So you can easily switch from object, weight, vertex, texture, edit mode, sculpt mode. And again, they've got shortcut keys, so I can simply press, let's say, 7. And now I'm in weight painting mode. Control Tab to bring it up, and you can just simply jump back to object mode. So nice and easy to just jump between the different modes without switching it in the top left here, though quite honestly that's not too much more effort either. Another useful radial menu that has been added is now under the tilde key, the little squiggly just above your tab on the left hand side. So that'll actually bring up the view option, so you can now simply switch to your left view, or your front view, or your right view without using the numpad, which again, not everyone has. As I mentioned, you can also click on these bubbles here on the little view axis gizmo. So if I press X, I'm now gone into the right orthographic view. And again, it just makes it easier to navigate around. There's just more options to do the same thing. And it just makes using Blender so much easier because I'm not forced to do it one specific way. There's lots of different ways to achieve the exact same thing. Other things that have definitely been improved in Blender, let's just select this light right here. If I come into the lights and let's switch this over, for example, to an area light, again, you've got all of these little additional gizmos here. Let's scale this up. So I've got this really nice area lights now. And again, there's just additional gimbals and additional controls available for all of these, just to make it a bit easier to navigate the scene and set everything up. And I really like all of these helper gizmos that are being added everywhere. Let's just change this maybe to a little bit yellow. Maybe let's just duplicate this light, move it over to the right. Let's just turn this into a spotlight. And then you can see these little nice controls just to make it easy to set everything up just the way I want it to. Also, one really exciting feature, if you are used to the older versions of Blender, if I just select two objects by holding Shift and press Tab to go into edit mode, you now have multi-object editing. So I can now actually select multiple objects, kind of extrude their faces. I can modify everything together. I can snap things together. And there are multiple, they're separate objects still, but I can edit them at the same time in Blender 2.80. So that's really great to have. It's, I think, a really, really useful feature. But now let's talk about one of the biggest stars of Blender 2.80, and that is EEVEE, the new real-time viewport rendering engine, which I've actually been using throughout this tutorial so far. If you go into your scene settings, you'll notice that my render engine is currently set to EEVEE. Now, EEVEE actually stands for Extremely Efficient Viewport Environment Engine, from what I know, and it is a real-time rendering engine that, well, renders everything real time in the viewport and is really, really powerful. It's not the same as using cycles. So Blender 2.80 has 3 render engines left. The Blender internal engine has been removed. Instead, you've got cycles, workbench, and EEVEE. EEVEE is real-time rendering in the viewport. It is not ray tracing, it is approximation of ray tracing, and I'll show you a few really cool things that you can actually do with it. Cycles is still the full ray trace rendering engine. It is a bit slower than EEVEE, but it is also much more accurate because obviously it's actual ray tracing, so you get realistic reflections and refractions and all of the things that you can only get with calculating the actual bounces of lights in your scene. Then you've got the Workbench engine, which looks a little bit flat, but again, you can actually set up all sorts of overlays and shading for that. This is mainly meant for modeling because it more shows you the geometry and the setup of your scene. So let's switch back to EEVEE because EEVEE is actually really cool. What I might do very quickly on this plane here. And again, if you're a newcomer, check out some of my beginner tutorials. I'll show you how to do some of this stuff. Let's set this to a fairly dark surface. And I actually want to make this quite reflective. So I'm actually going to jack up the metallicness of it and bring down the roughness. And you can already see I've got some reflections here on the light, which actually looks quite cool. But now with the render engine set on EEVEE, you've got a whole bunch of different options to enable some really cool effects real time in your viewport. So we can enable bloom. Now that's probably a bit too much bloom, so let's expand this a little bit. Maybe I'll bring down the intensity just a little bit, and just the radius down. I like a little bit of bloom, but too much to me feels a little bit cheap. You can obviously enable ambient occlusion, which I haven't really set up any materials for, so you won't really notice much of a difference. You can enable subsurface scattering, which again works real time in the viewport. Looks really, really cool. Again, don't have any materials for it. Separate tutorial if you want to. Just leave me some comments down below, as I said, on anything that I'm not really covering properly that you want to explore more in depth, because there's so much cool stuff. It's just, I'm not going to be able to fit it into a single video. Not without boring the living hell out of you anyway. But let's enable screen space reflections, because this is really cool. And this is now screen space reflections. You actually get reflections of the objects on all of your surfaces. It's approximated, it's not real, like Cycles, for example, will actually calculate the actual reflections of these objects using ray tracing. EEVEE is an approximation, but it does look really cool. It works real time in your viewport. And again, like any other engine, you can just hit F12 and render this out, and it renders really quickly. Now, my camera isn't really set up properly. If I jump into camera view, yeah, that's great. That's what I'm seeing. So let's press N very, very quickly. Lock my camera to my view. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit because, again, I'd at least like to see, a little bit and kind of see some of these cool reflections down here. Unlock, press N, and let's render that out again. And yeah, that took about, like 0.81 of a second to render this out. And this is really great. Like, EEVEE is not just for, demos or samples. You can use this for your final render because it actually looks really, really great. If you find that some of these screen space reflections aren't detailed enough, you can check up the precision, maybe the edge roughness down just a little bit, and you can even enable refraction. You can just kind of, detail them out a little bit more, and it looks really nice, real time in your viewport. So EEVEE is one of the biggest thing that is coming in with Blender 2.80. I'm really excited because it makes it so much more fun to work with, and it makes it super easy to render. Right now, as far as I can tell, EEVEE doesn't really support things like smoke and fire and particles all that well. In certain modes with certain settings, things don't really render, so there's still a bit of work to be done. But you will be able to, from what I can tell on the Blender Developers channel, you will be able to do everything in EEVEE that you can in Cycles, except it won't be quite as accurate as Cycles. But again, you'll also have options for motion blur, volumetric rendering, controlling the hair, shading, indirect lighting, a whole bunch of different settings, all available and all supported by EEVEE. So I'm really pumped for Blender 2.80 to be fully feature complete. Well, technically it's feature complete. There's just lots of little things that don't yet quite work, which is obviously where all of the extra dev work is going. But I'm super pumped. I'm really excited about EEVEE. Just have a look online. There's some amazing things already out there. This obviously is a really, really crummy little demo scene that I've whipped up here. It's nothing compared to what some of the artists have already done with Blender 2.80 and EEVEE. So go and check that out online. Some amazing things just to get you excited and pumped for what you'll be able to do. Now, you may already have noticed that the settings in the properties panel are now laid out vertically rather than horizontal. If we look at Blender 2.79, in the old properties panel, you can see that they're laid out horizontal, and I was never a big fan of it because it was kind of hard to find the ones at the back. I always thought it'd be much better to have them vertical, and now in Blender 2.80 they are vertical. Again, if you're used to the old version of Blender, you'll find that some of the settings are not where they used to be. Especially one of the biggest changes is actually that the render and output settings have been separated out because they're kind of conceptually slightly different on how you render something or what format you then save that final render as. And again, there's a few different changes on what is where and how things look, like the icons have changed. I'm still trying to get used to them. They're all visually much more distinct, but again, I just have to get used to them. By the way, if you want to switch through these easily and quickly, you can actually hover your mouse over them, hold Control, and then scroll on your mouse wheel to kind of just very quickly jump through all of them. By the way, if you want to expand a whole bunch of them, you can actually click, hold, and then just drag up, and you can expand them all. And you can also Control click with your middle mouse button and then just drag up and down to scale the interface up or down in any way that you want. But to me, this makes a lot more sense, the vertical layout. And again, you may have to get used to where these settings have moved to now. If you're new to Blender, don't stress about it. There's a ton of stuff you can do in Blender, from managing materials, modifiers, dealing with world and scene settings, output rendering, particle system, hair, additional textures, UV mapping, and much, much more. It takes a while to get used to Blender, but I like Blender 2.80. I don't think is much more complicated than maybe Cinema 4D, like the new layout, how things are structured. It's much more streamlined. It works much better. So I'm really, really pumped, in case I haven't told you 100 times already. Finally, the last thing I want to touch on, and this will impact you a little bit more if you're used to how Blender used to work, is that the old system for render layers is gone. If you select an object, press M, there's no more move to layer. You also don't have the layer visibility switches anywhere anymore. Instead, what comes up is move to collection, because Blender 2.80 now properly supports collections, which if you come from Cinema 4D or any other 3D program makes total sense. Over the right hand side in the outliner, let me just make this a little bigger, not only do you see new colored icons and much more easily accessible switches, you'll also see there's a collection right here. So I can actually right click in here and just create a new collection. Let's call this one lights. And then I can drag a whole bunch of lights into this collection. And again, it's an easy way to group these things together. I can now disable them as a group. I can render them or switch them off in any way you want. And obviously with an object selected, I can press M and then add it to the lights collection. Doesn't really make sense, so I can just move it back to the basic collection, or directly from here I can create a new collection and add the new object into it and just manage my scene and control everything a whole lot easier. Now, the one thing that you used to get with the layers in Blender is that you can actually render out multiple passes and have different objects visible in different passes. These view layers, and I'm sorry if I'm not using the right terminology, I think they're sometimes also called render layers, or maybe that was just in Blender 2.79. Up in the top right hand corner, I can see that I'm currently on the view layer called view layer. Let's rename this one to default layer. What I might do, I might move my 3D cursor just a little bit. Shift and A, by the way, to get easy access to the add menu. And you'll find that Blender is full of shortcut keys that make life a whole lot easier. Takes a while to get used to, but again, it is super useful. Let me just add a UV sphere. I'm just going to move it up a little bit and shade it smooth. Maybe I'll just give it a nice red material. I'm just going to drag it. Let's just make a new collection for it. So object selected, press M, new collection. Let's call this collection red, hit OK, and it's added the red sphere right in there. Now on my default layer, I'm just going to leave everything. So this is what is going to get rendered. Let me go to camera view. This is what is going to get rendered in my default layer. But let's add a new one. Let's call this layer no red. And now I can right click on my red collection in the outliner and go to view layer, set exclude. So don't render the red collection in this view layer. So now I've got my default layer and my no reds view layer. The cool thing is, if I now press F12 to render this out, I will actually get two layers. So this here is my default layer, but I also have another pass where this object isn't visible. And this makes it really easy to A, organize all of the objects in my scene, show and hide them at will. And again, you have another switch up here, so show different collections, so lights collection, or the base collection. I can show and hide them from here, but also use them to determine what gets rendered into which layer if you want to do some visual effects compositing or some other fancy stuff in the end. So collections, again, a really, really nice feature to have in Blender 2.80. There's still tons more that I haven't shown you yet in this video. One of the biggest new features obviously is the rebuild or redesign of the grease pencil, which is a full 2D animation tool where you can literally build full 2D animated movies very, very easily. If you do have some, artistic skill, so Grease Pencil, probably worth a totally full separate video. There's other things like all of the editor types. Lots of things have been split. So you've got the shader editor, the texture node editor. You've got UV editing and image editor. Lots of things have been split, renamed. It's just been made more consistent and just more logical. Like if you're new to Blender, all of these things should make a whole lot more sense. And for those people coming from older versions of Blender, we just have to relearn a little bit. It's not that difficult. But there's so much cool stuff. There's video editing, compositing. There's also a new dependency graph, which actually is bit more of an internal thing, but it just improves the performance. There's open subdiv. So subdivisions in Blender used to be quite slow. If you had a lot of vertices, Blender would slow down considerably. There's better cloth simulations. There's now a move towards more proceduralism with using more nodes for everything, not just for the shaders themselves, but for other things like for animations. Sculpting is going to get an overhaul pretty soon. I think they're going to do another code quest for it. And there's so much more coming. So Blender 2.80, just with EEVEE, with the new tools, the new layouts, it is so much more usable than Blender 2.79. Go and check it out. Either if you're new to Blender, go and check it out. It's an awesome tool. It's free. It runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. There's no reason not to use it. I've got a bunch of tutorials on my channel already that I'm going to link you down below. Go and check them out. Most of them are for Blender 2.79, but again, most of the principles will apply across. And if you've used Blender before, check out some of the daily builds for Blender 2.80. It is getting close to being finalized and finished and released, and it's amazing what you can do with it. I'm super pumped, and I hope you like this video, and I can guarantee you there will be tons more tutorials for Blender 2.80, especially now that we're getting close to the actual release. And that's all there is to it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to click the little bell so you actually get notified. If you want to watch some more cool filmmaking, visual effects, and Blender tutorials, be sure to click the links over on the left-hand side. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.